He stared at her for a long moment, his young, tired eyes searching her face for any hint of deceit or pity. He found none, only sincere concern. Slowly, a tentative curiosity replaced the wariness. "Why?" he asked. The insult, so direct and brutal, hung in the air. Julian's jaw clenched. "Watch your mouth, Marcus!" The rain fell in sheets, a cold, relentless cascade against the grimy windows of the Daily Grind diner. Inside, Ilara moved with a practiced, almost invisible grace, her hands a blur as she cleared tables, refilled coffee cups, and delivered plates of greasy food with a serene smile. She was a master of her craft, a waitress of exceptional skill and perception. She knew the regulars' orders before they even sat down, could anticipate a customer's need for a napkin before they realized it themselves, and navigated the cramped, chaotic space with the precision of a seasoned dancer. Marcus ignored him, his focus still on Ilara. He saw her as nothing more than a pawn, an easy target to discredit Julian and reassert his own dominance. He was the one who was supposed to be the heir, the one who was supposed to take over Vance Industries. Julian, the younger son from a different mother, had always been a thorn in his side, a more charismatic, more intelligent rival. And now Julian had brought in this simple girl. It was an intolerable affront. Yet, despite her quiet competence, she was often overlooked, a mere fixture in the bustling, indifferent world of the downtown lunch rush. To the customers, she was simply the girl with the gentle eyes. To her manager, an abrasive man named Mr. Henderson, she was a unit of efficiency, a worker bee to be driven relentlessly. He saw her kindness as a weakness, her soft-spoken nature as a lack of ambition. "Fine," Marcus said, a malicious glint in his eyes. "If she's to be an analyst, let's see what she can do." He turned to Julian. "I'll give her a project, a real one. The upcoming merger with Horizon Technologies. Our data on their market valuation is a mess. I want a full comprehensive report on their financial standing, market penetration, and projected growth, all by the end of the day. A perfect, mistake-free document. Think of it as her initiation. Ilara, table 5 needs more napkins. Now," he barked, his voice a grating intrusion into the rhythmic clatter of plates and silverware. "And stop smiling so much. You're here to work, not to make friends." The task was a trap, a clear and deliberate act of sabotage. It was a project that would take a team of experienced analysts weeks. Not a single person, hours. Julian knew it was impossible. "Marcus, you know that's not fair. She just started." Ilara's smile didn't falter. Though a flicker of hurt passed through her eyes, she moved to the supply closet, her movements as calm and unhurried as ever, and emerged with a full stack of napkins. She approached table 5, a group of boisterous businessmen, and placed the napkins on the table with a quiet politeness that seemed to settle the loud atmosphere around them. Fair," Marcus laughed. "Fair is for the weak. Little brother, this is the real world. Or did you forget that during your little slumming trip?" He turned and strode out of the office as abruptly as he had entered, leaving a wake of cold hostility behind him. The world outside the diner was a study in stark contrasts. While the diners inside enjoyed their warm meals, shielded from the downpour, the street was a swirling symphony of cold rain, honking cars, and hurried pedestrians. Ilara, in a rare moment of stillness, glanced out the window as she wiped down a countertop. Her gaze fell upon a small figure huddled in the doorway of a closed bookstore across the street. Alexander sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "He will test you, Miss Ilara," he said, his voice now almost weary. "He will try to break you. Do not let him." It was a boy, no older than 10, his thin frame shivering violently. He was dressed in rags, his face smudged with dirt, and he hugged his knees to his chest, trying in vain to escape the biting cold that had seeped into his very bones. His hair, a mass of damp curls, was plastered to his forehead. He wasn't begging or asking for anything. He was simply enduring, a silent testament to the harsh realities of the city. Ilara stood, her heart now steady, her mind clear. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a quiet, burning resolve. She had been underestimated her entire life. Marcus Vance was just another Mr. Henderson, a man who saw only what was on the surface. She would not be broken. She had faced far more difficult things than a stack of data. A wave of profound empathy washed over Ilara. She saw not a beggar, but a child, lost and vulnerable in the storm. The image struck a chord deep within her, a visceral pang of compassion that she couldn't ignore. Her own life was far from easy. She lived in a small, cramped apartment, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. But she had a roof over her head, a warm bed, and food in her stomach. The contrast was a painful one. Julian stood as well, his eyes meeting hers. Ilara, I'm sorry about that. This is not what I intended. Her shift was almost over. Ilara's mind began to race, calculating. She had her pay for the week in her pocket. A small wad of crumpled bills. It was money she'd been saving for a new pair of work shoes. The soles of her current ones worn thin and full of holes. She looked at the bills, then back at the shivering boy. The decision was instantaneous, and she didn't even have to think twice. Her worn shoes could wait. The boy could not. It's okay, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. I'm not afraid of a little hard work. Or him. She gestured to the door where Marcus had exited. He seems to think that the value of a person is in their suit or their title, but I know that's not true. She clocked out, ignoring Mr. Henderson's disapproving glare. Where are you going, Ilara? You're 5 minutes early, he grumbled. A genuine, warm smile broke across Julian's face. He knew she was not just saying the words, she truly believed them. He had brought her here because she was kind, but he was starting to realize that her kindness was only a fraction of her true strength. He led her to a small, isolated cubicle in a far corner of the floor, a space meant for temporary employees and interns. On the desk was a laptop, a pile of disorganized files, and a note with the words Horizon Technologies Merger scrawled across the top. I have a personal matter to attend to, she said, her voice soft but firm. I can help you, Julian offered. This isn't fair, he snorted. Don't let it interfere with your work tomorrow. Ilara shook her head. No, I want to do this on my own. It's a test, and I will pass it. She sat down, turned on the laptop, and began to calmly sort through the chaotic piles of documents. She had faced the lion's den, and instead of shrinking, she had found her courage. She would not only complete the task but do it with the same quiet competence that had made her a master of her old world. The battle lines had been drawn. Marcus saw her as a charity case. He would soon learn that she was a strategist. Ilara didn't respond. She simply pulled her raincoat over her uniform and stepped out into the pouring rain. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she barely noticed. She crossed the street, her eyes fixed on the boy. As she got closer, she saw the small, defeated slump of his shoulders, the way his lips were tinged with blue. Ilara sat at her small, isolated desk, surrounded by a mountain of disorganized data. The project on Horizon Technologies was indeed a trap, designed not to test her skills, but to expose her as a fraud. Marcus had deliberately provided her with incomplete spreadsheets, outdated market reports, and conflicting financial statements. A less resilient person would have crumbled under the weight of the impossible task, overwhelmed by the sheer chaos of the documents. But Ilara's mind, trained in the unpredictable and high-pressure environment of the daily grind, was a quiet, strategic engine. She knelt down a few feet away, careful not to startle him. Hey, she said gently. Her voice was warm and kind, a stark contrast to the cold, wet air. She saw the mess not as a failure, but as a puzzle. Her years of observing human behavior had taught her to look beyond the obvious, to find the hidden patterns in the chaos. Just as she had learned to read the subtle body language of a customer, she now began to read the patterns in the data. She noticed that certain expense reports were missing, that the revenue numbers in one file didn't match the numbers in another, and that there were significant, unexplained gaps in the company's growth timeline. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate omissions. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and caution. They were a stunning shade of green, a vibrant, unexpected splash of color in his otherwise desolate appearance. He didn't speak, just watched her warily. Ilara didn't rush. She worked with the same calm, deliberate pace she used when the diner was at its busiest. First, she organized the chaos. She created a logical filing system for the documents, cross-referencing everything and meticulously noting every discrepancy. She used the company's internal network to search for additional, publicly available information on Horizon Technologies, pulling up news articles, press releases, and SEC filings. She was not just an analyst, she was a detective. She was a waitress turned strategist, using her innate abilities to navigate a world that was designed to chew her up and spit her out. I wanted to help, Alara said, her words feeling clumsy. The rain is so cold. You need to get out of this. Julian, watching from a distance, was mesmerized. He had offered to help, but Alara had refused, her resolve as solid as a rock. He saw her at lunch, eating a simple sandwich at her desk, her eyes never leaving the screen. He saw her stay late, the glow of her monitor the last light on the floor. He saw her not as a damsel in distress, but as a warrior, fighting her own quiet battle. He found himself drawn to her, not out of a sense of duty, but out of a deep and growing admiration. He would bring her coffee, a quiet gesture of support, and she would simply nod, a small, grateful smile on her face, before returning to her work. The boy remained silent. He watched her every move as she fumbled in her pocket, pulling out the money. It was all she had, $75. It wasn't much, but it felt like a fortune to her. Marcus, meanwhile, reveled in his supposed victory. He passed by Alara's cubicle with a smirk, fully expecting to see her in tears or packing her things. He would then go to his father, claiming Alara was a mistake, a waste of resources, and that Julian's judgment was flawed. But each time he passed, Alara was there, her head bent in concentration, her composure unshaken. Her calmness infuriated him. She held the money out to him. His gaze shifted from her face to the bills, a look of profound distrust clouding his eyes. He didn't take it. The night before the deadline, Julian found Alara still at her desk, the surrounding area now littered with neatly stacked files and handwritten notes. The laptop screen was a web of complex charts and meticulously organized spreadsheets. She had not only analyzed the data, but she had also restructured it, creating a clear, comprehensive, and coherent report that told a very different story than the one Marcus had tried to present. "I don't need charity," he said, his voice surprisingly deep and resolute for someone so young. "I'm not asking for money." "You've done it," Julian said, his voice filled with a profound respect. Alara felt a pang of frustration. This was more difficult than she had imagined, but she understood his pride. She withdrew her hand. "I know," she said, her voice still gentle. "And I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a trade." Alara looked up, a weary but victorious smile on her face. It was a difficult puzzle, but the pieces are all here now. The boy's brow furrowed in confusion. A trade. She presented the report the next morning. It was a masterpiece of clarity and strategic insight. While Marcus's initial data had painted a picture of Horizon Technologies as a struggling company ripe for a hostile takeover, Alara's report showed the opposite. She had discovered a network of shell companies and hidden assets that, once accounted for, revealed a company with immense untapped potential. Her report detailed a strategic plan for a collaborative merger, not a hostile one, that would benefit both Vance Industries and Horizon, and would yield a far greater profit in the long run. "Yes," she said, a small, genuine smile lighting up her face. "You give me your cold, wet clothes, and I'll trade you for some new ones. Something warm and dry." The presentation was held in the company's main conference room, a large, intimidating space filled with senior executives and board members. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his sneer firmly in place, confident that Alara's presentation would be a disaster. Julian sat beside her, a silent, unwavering pillar of support. "Because no one should have to be this cold," Alara said simply. Alara stood at the podium, her voice calm and clear, her demeanor radiating a quiet authority that commanded attention. She began her presentation, walking them through her findings, not with complex jargon, but with simple, undeniable facts. She showed them the discrepancies she had uncovered, the missing documents, and the hidden assets. She didn't accuse or point fingers, she simply presented the data, allowing the numbers to speak for themselves. The boy considered her words, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She clicked to the final slide, which displayed a stark, unassailable conclusion. "Based on this analysis," she said, her voice ringing with certainty, "a hostile takeover would not only be a moral failure, but a financial one. The true value of Horizon Technologies lies in a partnership, a collaboration that leverages both our strengths to create something greater. I have included a detailed plan for this in the full report." Alara's heart swelled. "Wait right here," she said, rising to her feet. "I'll be right back." A stunned silence fell over the room. Julian's father, Alexander Vance, sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on Alara. His face was unreadable, but Julian could see the shift in his gaze, a flicker of something far deeper than simple respect. It was a flicker of genuine admiration, a recognition of a truly superior mind. Marcus, on the other hand, was pale with fury. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white against the table. The trap he had set had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own incompetence and duplicity. The very thing he had used to try and destroy her had become her greatest triumph. She ran down the street, the rain plastering her uniform to her body, her worn shoes squelching with every step. She ducked into a small clothing store, its lights a beacon of warmth against the gray evening. The store owner, a kind, elderly woman named Mrs. Old Gable, watched as Alara, dripping wet, began to frantically search the racks. The aftermath of Alara's presentation was a whirlwind. Her project, once a tool of sabotage, had become a blueprint for the company's future. The collaborative merger with Horizon Technologies was a resounding success, and Alara, the junior analyst, was now a name whispered in the hallowed halls of Vance Industries. She was no longer just the waitress Julian had hired. She was a brilliant strategist in her own right. Her composure and quiet confidence under pressure had not only impressed Alexander Vance, but had also earned her the grudging respect of some of the senior executives who had witnessed her presentation. "Can I help you, dear Mrs.?" Gable asked, her voice laced with concern. For Julian, the victory was more than professional. It was personal. He had been right about her. Her value lay not in her background, but in her character and her mind. He found himself seeking her out, not for work, but for conversation. They would share lunch in the cafeteria, where Alara, still frugal by habit, would eat a simple, homemade meal while Julian would have a gourmet sandwich from the executive kitchen. They talked about everything: books, art, their childhoods. He learned about her quiet, simple life, and she, in turn, learned about the lonely, isolated existence of a young man raised in the shadow of a corporate empire. Their relationship blossomed into a deep, genuine friendship, built on a foundation of mutual respect and trust. "I need clothes," Alara said, her eyes scanning the children's section. "For a boy, about 10 years old, something warm, a thick hoodie, jeans, maybe a coat if you have one." Marcus, however, was consumed by a cold, simmering rage. Alara's success was a personal humiliation, a blatant and public failure on his part. He had underestimated her, and now he had to pay the price. He was called into Alexander's office and reprimanded for his incompetence. He could see the disappointment in his father's eyes, a look that cut deeper than any words. He knew he couldn't let Alara win. He had to regain his standing, and the only way to do that was to destroy her. Permanently. "Mrs." Gable's eyes followed Alara's urgent movements. She saw the desperation, the selfless intent. "You're all wet," she said softly. "Are these for someone else?" He began to weave a new, more dangerous web of deceit. Using his position as head of corporate strategy, he had access to a vast network of contacts and data. He began to plant false information, manipulating internal financial records to make it appear as though Alara was taking bribes from Horizon Technologies. He created fake emails, forged documents, and a trail of breadcrumbs that led straight to her. He was not just trying to discredit her professionally, he was trying to ruin her life. "Yes," Alara replied, finally pulling a thick, fleece-lined hoodie from a rack. "A boy. He's so cold." She grabbed a pair of jeans and a waterproof jacket. She held them up, her heart pounding. The price tag seemed impossibly large, adding up to far more than the $75 she had. Julian, ever vigilant, noticed the change in the company's atmosphere. The whispers had gone from admiration to suspicion. He would catch glimpses of people looking at Alara with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. He confronted Marcus, his voice low and dangerous. She took a shaky breath and approached the counter, the clothes clutched tightly in her arms. Mrs. Gable's expression was one of understanding and compassion. "What are you doing?" Julian demanded, cornering him in a quiet hallway. I don't have enough," Alara admitted, her voice trembling slightly. She laid out the crumpled bills on the counter, This is all I have. I was saving for shoes. But she trailed off, unable to meet the old woman's gaze. Marcus's smirk was venomous. I don't know what you're talking about, little brother. I'm simply a loyal employee, looking out for the company's best interests. It seems your little friend has a few skeletons in her closet. Maybe you should have looked a little closer before you brought her into our lives. Mrs. Gable looked at the small pile of money, then at the clothes, and finally at Alara's kind, anxious face. She reached out and gently placed her hand over Alara's. Dear, she said, the rain outside is cold, but what you are doing, that is a warmth that money cannot buy. Julian knew he was lying. He had an unwavering faith in Alara's integrity. He had seen her give away her last penny. She was incapable of such a betrayal. He went to Alara, his expression filled with concern. Alara, people are saying? They're saying you're taking bribes from Horizon. She picked up the items and began to fold them neatly, ignoring the price tags. When she was done, she put them in a paper bag and handed it to Alara. Alara's face, which had been so full of light, went pale. She had felt the change in the air, too. She had seen the sideways glances, the sudden silence when she entered a room. But she had hoped it was just her imagination. The truth, spoken aloud, was a punch to the gut. But that's not true, she stammered. It's a gift, Mrs. Gable said, her eyes twinkling. From one kind heart to another. I know, Julian said, his hand reaching out to grasp hers. A comforting, solid anchor. And we're going to prove it. Alara's eyes welled up with tears. But I can't accept that. Their relationship, once a nascent friendship, now became a desperate partnership. They had to work together to expose Marcus's latest scheme. This time, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about a project or a job. It was about Alara's reputation, her freedom, and the trust they had built between them. They began their secret investigation, a clandestine operation conducted late at night in Alara's small, isolated cubicle. You already have, Mrs. Ungable replied with a knowing smile. Now go, he's waiting. Alara's past skills proved invaluable. She was an expert at noticing small details, tiny anomalies in a sea of information. They went through every document, every email, every report that had been touched by the Horizon merger. They looked for traces of Marcus's manipulation, for the subtle fingerprints of his deceit. They found it in the metadata of a document, a single, misaligned timestamp. They found it in the syntax of a forged email, a phrase that Marcus used often but was uncharacteristic for the supposed sender. They found it in the strange, convoluted routing of a financial transaction. Marcus had been careless, blinded by his own arrogance, and they were beginning to peel back the layers of his conspiracy. Alara, overwhelmed with gratitude, rushed back out into the rain, the paper bag held close to her chest. She found the boy exactly where she had left him. She knelt down again and opened the bag, holding up the clothes. The deeper they dug, the more Marcus's web of deceit unraveled. They discovered that he had not only tried to frame Alara, but had also been using the shell companies he had accused her of creating to embezzle company funds. His actions were not just about petty revenge. They were a systematic, long-standing act of corruption that threatened the very foundation of Vance Industries. Here, she said, a wide, relieved smile on her face. They're dry and warm. You can change inside the bookstore doorway. Out of the rain. Julian's trust in Alara was absolute, and her trust in him was the same. Their bond, forged in a rainstorm and strengthened by a shared fight for justice, was now unbreakable. They were a team, a quiet force against the powerful, a pair of unlikely heroes in a world of corporate greed and ambition. They were ready for the next phase of their battle. They were ready to confront Marcus and expose his entire web of deceit. The boy looked from the new clothes to Alara's face. His green eyes, so full of a wisdom that belied his years, softened. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He took the bag, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment. A strange, almost electric current seemed to pass between them. A silent acknowledgement of a connection forged not in wealth or power, but in a simple act of humanity. Julian and Alara's clandestine investigation was a race against the clock. Marcus was not only trying to frame Alara, but was also actively trying to cover his tracks, erasing digital evidence and threatening his co-conspirators. The corporate world, they were discovering, was a ruthless battlefield, and they were woefully outgunned. They knew they needed an ally, someone inside the company who could help them navigate the treacherous political landscape of Vance Industries. "Thank you," he said, his voice no longer guarded, but filled with a quiet, profound sincerity. That ally came in the form of a quiet, unassuming man named Arthur, a longtime personal assistant to CEO Alexander Vance. Arthur had witnessed Marcus's rise to power, and he had seen the subtle but insidious corruption that had taken root within the company. He was a man of quiet integrity, a loyal servant who had become disillusioned by the ambition and arrogance of the heir apparent. He had seen the way Marcus had treated Alara and the way Julian had stood by her, and it had stirred something in him, a sense of justice that he could no longer ignore. Alara simply nodded, her heart full. She watched as he disappeared into the recessed doorway to change, the sight of him in the new, clean clothes, a balm to her soul. She had spent every dollar she had, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly rich. She turned and began to walk back toward the diner, the rain now feeling less like a punishment and more like a gentle, cleansing shower. She didn't know the boy's name, or where he came from, or where he was going. She only knew that she had done something right, something that mattered. The cold was a small price to pay for that feeling. Arthur approached Alara and Julian one evening, his face a mask of quiet determination. "I have something that might help you," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I have access to the old company archives. Marcus has been using a network of dummy corporations to launder money, but the original records, the ones from before he took over the department, are still there. They're physical, not digital, and he hasn't thought to destroy them." Little did she know, this simple act of kindness was about to change the entire trajectory of her life. The boy she had helped was no mere street urchin. He was Julian, the son of a billionaire CEO, a young man on a personal quest, a journey that had led him to her, to this very moment in the pouring rain. And the trade she had offered worn shoes for a stranger's warmth was a seed that would blossom into something far greater than she could ever imagine. It was a story that had just begun. His information was a breakthrough, a vital piece of the puzzle that Marcus had overlooked in his hubris. The archives were a labyrinth of old files and forgotten documents, a world away from the gleaming modern offices above. Julian and Alara spent a weekend in the dusty, quiet solitude of the basement, their hands and clothes quickly becoming smudged with dust and time. They scoured through boxes of old records, their hearts pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. Julian watched her go, a ghost of a smile lingering on his lips. The rain, once a symbol of his hardship, now seemed to sparkle with a new light. He pulled the warm hoodie over his head, the soft fabric a revelation against his skin. The clean jeans felt strange but comforting. Alara had not seen his chauffeur-driven car parked a block away, or the two silent bodyguards who had been observing the entire scene from a discreet distance. Her kindness was genuine, a rare and precious commodity in the world he inhabited, a world built on transactions and hidden motives. Alara's past life as a waitress had taught her to be patient, to find order in chaos, and to look for patterns. She applied those skills now, meticulously sifting through ledgers, expense reports, and correspondence. She noticed a pattern of strange, small payments to a series of seemingly unrelated shell companies. She cross-referenced these with the dummy corporations Julian had found in the digital records. They were a perfect match. The physical documents provided the proof of the transactions, while the digital files showed where the money had gone. Julian was not 10 years old, a fact his youthful appearance and calculated choice of tattered clothing had helped to conceal. He was a 22-year-old heir, the scion of Vance Industries, a global technology and media conglomerate. His family's wealth was staggering, but to him, it had always felt more like a cage than a kingdom. He was on a personal mission, a self-imposed test to find someone real. His father, the formidable CEO Alexander Vance, had often expressed his cynicism about the human condition, believing that everyone had a price. Julian had always disagreed, but he had to prove it to himself. He had spent the last 2 weeks on the streets, posing as a runaway, a young beggar, an invisible soul, observing how people reacted to him. The results had been predictably disheartening. He had been ignored, shooed away, and condescended to. But then, there was Alara. They worked tirelessly, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose. They discovered that Marcus had been running this operation for years, siphoning off millions from the company's research and development budget, all while publicly criticizing the very departments he was robbing. They found forged signatures, doctored financial statements, and a meticulously detailed spreadsheet that laid out his entire operation, a testament to his arrogance. He had been so confident in his ability to cover his tracks that he hadn't even bothered to destroy the evidence. Her act of kindness, spontaneous and unconditional, was a lightning strike in the gloom. It wasn't just the money, it was the way she had looked at him. Not with pity or disdain, but with simple, human concern. She had treated him as an equal, offering a trade to preserve his dignity. That was a level of empathy and strategic thinking he had never encountered. He had found what he was looking for, in the unlikeliest of places. As they dug deeper, they found something more disturbing. Marcus was not only embezzling from Vance Industries, but was also using the ill-gotten gains to fund a network of shady, off-the-books investments. He was building his own shadow empire, a corrupt mirror image of the company he was supposed to one day inherit. This was not just about revenge against Julian. It was about power, about consolidating his control and building a foundation for his own reign. He walked calmly back to the waiting car, the once sodden clothes in the paper bag she had given him. He handed the bag to his head of security, a stoic man named Daniel. "Find out everything you can about her," Julian instructed, his voice low and serious. "Her name, where she works, everything, but do it quietly. I want to meet her again, on my terms." The evidence they were uncovering was overwhelming and unassailable, but they knew it wasn't enough to simply present the evidence. Marcus had a powerful network of allies, people he had bribed and manipulated over the years. He would deny everything, and his allies would stand by him. They needed to force his hand, to create a situation where he would have no choice but to expose himself. The next day, Julian was back in his natural habitat, a penthouse office with panoramic views of the city skyline. He sat across from his father, who was immersed in a flurry of spreadsheets and reports. Alexander Vance was a man of steel and ambition, a self-made titan who had built an empire from nothing. He was also a pragmatist to the core, and his relationship with his son was defined by a shared intellect and a cold distance. Julian's quiet demeanor gave way to the strategic brilliance of his father. He devised a plan, a masterful trap that would use Marcus's own arrogance against him. They would leak a small, seemingly insignificant piece of false information, a fabricated report about a new, highly profitable investment opportunity. They would leak it through one of Marcus's less trusted contacts, ensuring that the information would make its way back to him. "Your little social experiment is over, Julian," Alexander said, not looking up from his tablet. "I trust you've learned something about the true nature of people." The plan was a high-stakes gamble. If it failed, they would not only lose their jobs, but would also expose themselves to Marcus's ruthless retaliation. But they knew it was their only chance. Ilara, the girl who had once spent her last $75 on a stranger, now found herself at the heart of a corporate conspiracy, a quiet but formidable force. Using her intuition and intellect to take down a giant, they were ready for the next phase, a dangerous game of cat and mouse where the stakes were nothing less than their careers, their reputations, and the future of Vance Industries itself. "I have," Julian replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. "I've learned that you were wrong." Marcus, blinded by his own arrogance, walked directly into the trap Julian had set. The fake report about the new, highly profitable investment opportunity, a non-existent company called Ether Dynamics, landed on his desk. He saw it not as a trap, but as an unexpected gift, a chance to regain the favor he had lost with his father and the board. He was a man who believed in his own invincibility, and he was convinced that no one could possibly outsmart him. He didn't bother to verify the information. He simply presented the proposal to the board, his confidence and charisma papering over the non-existent details. Alexander finally looked up, his sharp, gray eyes narrowing. "Elaborate!" The presentation was a flawless performance. Marcus spoke with a passion and conviction that swayed the room, painting a picture of a revolutionary new technology and a massive return on investment. The board, accustomed to his high-stakes gambles, was impressed. The vote to move forward with the acquisition was unanimous. Marcus, with a triumphant smirk, looked directly at Julian and Ilara, as if to say, "You see, I always win. I met someone, Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. A waitress from a diner on 4th Street. She gave me her last $75, money she was saving for new shoes, to buy me clothes. She didn't know who I was. She didn't ask for anything in return. She simply saw a child who was cold. But as the meeting ended, Julian and Alara knew their moment had come. The next morning, before the market opened, they initiated the final phase of their plan. They called an emergency meeting with Julian's father, Alexander Vance, and Arthur, the loyal assistant who had been their silent ally. They presented a meticulously organized dossier, a physical document that contained all the evidence they had uncovered: the forged documents, the doctored financials, the physical ledgers from the archives, and the digital paper trail of Marcus's embezzlement and his network of shell companies. At the very end of the dossier was a single devastating page, a detailed point-by-point breakdown of the Ether Dynamics trap, a company that existed only in Julian's mind. Alexander's expression was unreadable, a flicker of something Julian couldn't quite decipher passing through his eyes before they hardened again. An anomaly, he said dismissively. A statistical outlier. You cannot base a worldview on a single charitable act. Alexander Vance, a man who had built his empire on logic and facts, read the report in stunned silence. His face, usually a mask of control, was a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally, a cold, simmering fury. He had always known his son Marcus was ambitious and arrogant, but he had never imagined the depth of his corruption. He looked at Julian and Alara, his gaze no longer just assessing, but filled with a new, profound respect. He had tested Julian with Alara, and Julian, in turn, had proven not only his worth, but his strategic genius. It wasn't an act of charity, Julian corrected. It was an act of kindness. There's a difference. She's intelligent, perceptive, and she possesses a moral compass stronger than anyone I've ever met in this building. He gestured to the sleek, opulent office. I want her on my team. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Marcus was summoned to the CEO's office. He walked in with his usual swagger, a self-satisfied smile on his face, believing he was there to be praised. He stopped short when he saw Julian and Alara standing beside his father, their expressions calm and resolute. He immediately sensed the shift in the air, the cold, accusatory silence that filled the room. Alexander leaned back, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. A waitress to work at Vance Industries. Julian, be serious. The board would never approve. Marcus, Alexander said, his voice as cold as steel. Explain this. He slid the dossier across the desk. I am serious, Julian countered, his voice gaining an edge. I've already scheduled an interview. We will bring her in, and you will see what I see. She has a way of seeing the unseen, of anticipating needs before they are spoken. Those are qualities that we can't buy. Marcus picked it up, his face still holding a ghost of a smirk. He flipped through the pages, his expression slowly dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He saw his forged signature, his meticulously detailed financial crimes, and finally, the damning report on Ether Dynamics. The smirk vanished, replaced by a desperate, trapped look. He was caught. Alexander sighed, a sound of weary exasperation. Do as you wish. But if she doesn't meet the standards, she's gone. He looked from his father's furious eyes to Julian's calm, knowing gaze, and finally to Alara's unwavering stare. He saw in her eyes not a triumphant glee, but a quiet, sad certainty. He had underestimated her, had treated her as a lesser being. And now she was a witness to his downfall. In a fit of desperate rage, he lunged at Julian. But the bodyguards Julian had discreetly placed outside the office were a step faster. They seized Marcus, holding him back as he screamed threats and denials. Julian knew it was the best he could hope for. The next day, a formal invitation was delivered to the Daily Grind. It was a stark, official letter, addressed to Alara and inviting her to an interview for an unspecified role at Vance Industries. You're nothing, Marcus shrieked, his face contorted with hatred. You're a fraud. You're a beggar who stumbled into a stroke of luck. And you will both pay for this. The letter caused an uproar at the diner. Mr. Henderson snatched it from her hand, his face a mask of disbelief and suspicion. Vance Industries. What did you do? Alara. Did you win the lottery? This must be some kind of prank. Alara's composure remained intact. She looked at him with an almost pitying expression. He was a man consumed by his own ego, a man who had built a kingdom on a foundation of sand, and now it was all crumbling around him. The confrontation was over. Marcus was no longer a threat. He was just a man, stripped of his power, his dignity, and his freedom. The truth had finally come to light, and it was a beacon of hope in the dark. Corrupt world of Vance Industries. His words echoed the doubts of her coworkers. They all looked at her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Alara, however, felt a profound sense of apprehension. The memory of the boy, Julian, was still fresh in her mind, and a strange intuition told her that this was no coincidence. She knew the letter was from him. But why? The public downfall of Marcus Vance was a spectacle, a grand theatrical climax to the quiet war Julian and Alara had waged. Alexander Vance, a man who valued the reputation of his company above all else, moved with ruthless efficiency. The very next day, a statement was issued, announcing Marcus's immediate termination and the commencement of a full internal investigation into his actions. The news sent shockwaves through the corporate world, a seismic event that shook the foundations of Vance Industries. Despite her fears, Alara decided to go. She had nothing to lose but a few hours of her day, and her sense of dignity demanded that she face whatever this was head-on. She spent the next day preparing, not for an interview, but for the unknown. She polished her only pair of presentable flats, pressed her one good blouse, and practiced her responses to every possible question. She was a professional, and she would treat this with the same quiet competence she brought to every aspect of her life. Marcus was not only fired but also faced a barrage of criminal charges. The evidence Julian and Alara had so meticulously collected was irrefutable. The forged documents, the digital paper trail of his financial crimes, the testimonies of his intimidated co-conspirators, all of it was presented to the authorities, a mountain of undeniable proof. Marcus, the golden boy, the heir apparent, was now a pariah, a cautionary tale of arrogance and greed. His power, once so absolute, had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his own self-destructive actions. The following morning, she arrived at the towering glass and steel monolith that was Vance Industries' headquarters. The building was a world away from the gritty, familiar streets she knew. The lobby was a cavern of polished marble and cold steel, a stark contrast to the warmth of Mrs. Gable's shop. A receptionist, impeccably dressed and radiating a sterile politeness, gestured for her to take a seat. With Marcus gone, a power vacuum was created within Vance Industries. The board, once skeptical of Julian, now saw him as a savior. He had not only exposed a deep-seated corruption, but had also shown a strategic brilliance and a moral compass that was far beyond his years. Julian was formally appointed as the company's new head of corporate strategy, a position he had earned not through birthright, but through sheer merit and courage. Alara sat alone in the cavernous lobby, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. She felt the weight of her humble clothes, the faint scent of diner coffee clinging to her hair. She was a fish out of water, a tiny, insignificant cog in a world of colossal machines. She felt the eyes of every passing employee on her, their gazes filled with judgment and quiet curiosity. For Alara, the change was even more profound. She was no longer a junior analyst, but a key figure in the company. Alexander Vance, in a rare display of public admiration, personally announced her promotion to Director of Special Projects. Her role was now to identify and dismantle any other hidden networks of corruption within the company, a task for which her unique skills of observation and intuition were perfectly suited. She was a silent guardian, a moral compass in a world of cutthroat business. Her desk was no longer a small cubicle, but a spacious office with a view of the city, a testament to her new status. Finally, an assistant came to escort her to the executive floor. The elevator ride was a blur of soaring numbers and silent ascent. The doors opened to a world of minimalist design, abstract art, and whispered conversations. She was led into a sprawling office, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a man and a boy, the boy she had met in the rain, who were waiting for her. Their victory was not without its emotional toll. Alara struggled to adjust to her new life. The public recognition, the constant media attention, and the lavish perks of her new position felt alien and overwhelming. She was a woman who had found comfort in the quiet rhythms of her life, and now she was at the center of a storm. She often found herself retreating to her old, isolated cubicle, a place where she had felt safe and grounded. Julian understood. He would find her there, his presence a quiet, comforting anchor in her new, chaotic world. The boy, now dressed in a sharp suit and a perfectly knotted tie, looked nothing like the shivering figure she had helped. His green eyes, however, were the same, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He rose to his feet, a respectful gesture she hadn't expected. Their relationship deepened, transcending the professional and the platonic. Julian, the heir who had everything, had found his equal in the woman who had nothing. He saw her not as a project to be saved, but as a person to be cherished. He loved her for her strength, for her kindness, for the way she had looked at him in the rain not as a beggar, but as a human being in need. And she, in turn, loved him for his humility, for his unwavering trust, and for the way he had fought for her when no one else would. "Elara," Julian said, his voice richer and more mature than she remembered. "Thank you for coming." One evening, as they sat together in his office, the city lights twinkling below them, Julian confessed his feelings. "Elara," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I didn't bring you here as a social experiment. I brought you here because I knew you were different. You are the kindest, most brilliant person I have ever met. He hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. "I fell in love with you that night in the rain." His father, Alexander Vance, remained seated, a powerful, imposing figure with a face carved from granite. His gaze was a piercing, assessing stare that seemed to strip her of her composure. He was the man from the news, from magazines, a legend of industry. Elara's heart, which had been so guarded, finally opened. She had been so focused on the battle, on the corporate intrigue, that she had not allowed herself to feel the profound connection that had been growing between them. She reached out and took his hand, her touch a silent confirmation of her own feelings. "Julian," she said, her voice a soft whisper, "I fell in love with you too, in a world full of people who only saw me for what I was. You saw me for who I was, and that, to me, is the greatest fortune of all." "Sit down," Alexander commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Let's get this over with." Their love was a quiet, profound victory, a testament to the idea that true value is found not in wealth or status, but in the unseen qualities of the heart. The battle was over, justice had been served, and a new, more beautiful chapter was just beginning. Julian shot his father a brief, warning glance before turning back to Elara. He gestured to a chair. "Please, Elara, we have a few questions for you." The aftermath of Marcus Vance's downfall was a seismic shift that rippled through every level of Vance Industries. The public spectacle, while initially embarrassing for the company, ultimately served as a powerful statement. It demonstrated that Alexander Vance, the patriarch, was willing to cut out the cancer of corruption, no matter who it was. The company's stock, after a brief dip, stabilized and then began a steady climb. Buoyed by the renewed public trust, the message was clear: integrity had won. Elara sat, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt a profound sense of both surrealism and impending doom. The boy had been Julian Vance, the CEO's son. The kindness she had shown had not been to a beggar, but to an heir. She had been tested, observed, and now she was here, in the heart of the kingdom he would one day rule. This was not a chance meeting. This was a consequence. For Marcus, the fall was swift and absolute. He was a man stripped of everything he had ever valued: his power, his name, his freedom. His network of co-conspirators, terrified of facing similar fates, began to cooperate with the authorities, providing more damning evidence against him. He was no longer the arrogant heir, he was a disgraced criminal, a man whose pride had led to his ruin. The justice served was not just legal, but poetic. And yet, as she looked from Julian's empathetic eyes to Alexander's scrutinizing ones, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. She would not be intimidated. She had nothing to be ashamed of. She had acted out of kindness. And if that was a weakness in their world, then so be it. She would answer their questions honestly, and let the chips fall where they may. A new chapter had begun, a consequence of her simple, genuine act. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a woman on the precipice of a new life, a life she never asked for, but one that was now irrevocably hers. Julian, now a figure of respect and admiration, moved with a newfound authority. He was no longer just his father's son, he was a leader in his own right. He used his new position to initiate a series of sweeping reforms within the company, creating new protocols for transparency and accountability. He promoted people based on merit, not on their connections or their status. He was building a new legacy for Vance Industries, one based on the values he and Ilara had fought for. Ilara sat in the plush leather chair, a small, composed island in the vast ocean of Alexander Vance's office. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city. Alexander Vance's gaze was a physical weight, a cold, clinical assessment that seemed to dissect her every word and gesture. Ilara, however, did not waver. She answered his questions with a quiet confidence that belied her humble origins. He asked about her work at the diner, not in a condescending way, but with a surprising focus on the logistics of her job. And Ilara, the quiet waitress, was at the heart of it all. Her promotion to Director of Special Projects was met with a mix of awe and curiosity from her colleagues. She moved through the halls with the same quiet grace and calm demeanor she had in the diner. But now, her presence commanded respect. Her office was no longer just a room with a view. It was a sanctuary of truth and integrity. She used her unique skills to find and expose the subtle pockets of corruption that Marcus had left behind, a quiet, methodical force for good. "You mentioned you could anticipate a customer's needs," Alexander said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Explain that." She found her rhythm in this new world, and as she did, she began to appreciate the unexpected gifts that came with it. She used her new salary to pay off her parents' debts, to help them live a life free from financial anxiety. She used her influence to create a scholarship fund for aspiring students from humble backgrounds, a silent tribute to her own journey. The money and the power were not for her. They were a tool for justice, a way to help others who were just like her. "It's about observation, sir," Ilara replied, her voice steady. "When a table sits down, you don't just see a group of people. You see a family with a fussy child who will need a high chair, a couple on a first date who will be too nervous to ask for a menu, a businessman who wants his coffee hot and fast. You watch their body language, the way they glance at the salt shaker, the way they shift uncomfortably in their seats. Every action is a signal. My job was to process those signals and act on them before the customer even realized they had a need. The most profound gift of all, however, was her relationship with Julian. Their love was no longer a secret. They were a team, a partnership built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect. They would often sit in his office, long after the workday was over, talking about their plans for the future. He would listen to her ideas, her insights, with a quiet intensity, and she would find comfort in his unwavering support. They were two halves of a whole, a powerful combination of ambition and kindness. Julian watched his father's face, a flicker of something Julian had never seen before, respectful intrigue crossing his features. Julian knew this was what he had hoped for. Ilara wasn't just talking about serving food, she was describing strategic analysis, foresight, and proactive problem-solving. These were the core competencies of Vance Industries. Their relationship was a testament to the idea that love could be found in the unlikeliest of places. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was real, honest, and built on the foundation of a shared struggle. Julian, the heir who had everything, had found his greatest treasure in a woman who had nothing. And Ilara, the waitress who had given away her last penny, had found a fortune far greater than any money could buy: love, respect, and a chance to change the world. The battle was over. Justice had been served, and for them, the real journey had just begun. Alexander leaned forward, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And what about conflict resolution? A busy kitchen, a rude customer, a mistake in an order?" The sun rose over the city, a golden promise illuminating the twin spires of the Vance Industries headquarters. Inside, a new day had dawned, one filled with the quiet confidence of a company reborn. The specter of Marcus Vance and his corruption had been banished, and in its place, a new era of integrity and purpose had begun. Ilara and Julian, No longer just allies in a war for justice, we're now the architects of this new world. Alara took a deep breath. The key is to de-escalate without losing your own dignity. A rude customer is not a personal attack. It's a symptom of a larger frustration. You acknowledge their feelings. You take responsibility for the issue, even if it's not your fault, and you offer a solution that makes them feel heard and valued. It's about managing expectations and, above all, remaining calm under pressure. Their relationship was a topic of whispered conversation in the hallways, a source of fascination and admiration. But for them, it was a quiet sanctuary, a bond forged in trust and strengthened by a shared sense of purpose. They were a study in contrast that complemented each other perfectly. Julian, with his strategic brilliance and quiet authority, was the visionary, the one who saw the big picture. Alara, with her profound empathy and her talent for noticing the unseen, was the heart, the one who ensured that every decision was made with a sense of humanity and justice. Alexander finally nodded. A slow, deliberate movement. You are more than what you appear to be, Miss Alara. He glanced at Julian, a look of grudging admission in his eyes. You've proven your point, Julian. Her resume may be empty, but her mind is not. He turned his attention back to Alara. We'll offer you a position, a probationary one. Of course, you'll start as a junior project analyst, reporting directly to my son, Julian. Do not disappoint him. Their days were a blur of meetings, presentations, and strategic planning sessions. But they always found time for each other. They would steal moments in the quiet solitude of Julian's office, sharing coffee and conversation, their hands clasped in a silent acknowledgement of their bond. Their love was not about grand gestures or public displays. It was in the small, quiet moments of understanding and support. Alara's heart skipped a beat. A junior project analyst. It sounded like something out of a movie. She nodded, a quiet and firm assent. I won't, sir. Thank you. Alara's life, once a predictable cycle of serving coffee and making ends meet, had been transformed beyond her wildest imagination. She was no longer just a woman who worked in a diner. She was a leader, a woman who commanded respect and wielded her influence with a gentle, yet firm, hand. She used her position not for personal gain, but to create a better world for others. The scholarship fund she had created was thriving, helping young people from humble backgrounds to get an education and a chance at a better life. She had, in her own way, become a beacon of hope, a living testament to the idea that kindness and integrity could triumph over greed and ambition. Just as she was about to stand, the office door opened with a sudden, jarring force, and a new figure strode in without knocking. He was a man in his late 20s, dressed in a custom-tailored suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly. His hair was slicked back, his jaw was sharp, and his eyes, a colder, more calculating shade of green than Julian's, swept over the room. His name was Marcus Vance, Julian's older half-brother and the company's head of corporate strategy. Marcus was the product of Alexander's first marriage, a man groomed since birth for power, and he radiated a palpable sense of entitlement and arrogance. Julian, too, had been transformed by their shared journey. He had been a lonely, isolated heir, a man who saw the world as a game of strategy and power. But Alara had taught him that the greatest victories were not won with cunning, but with compassion. He had found in her a partner, a lover, and a friend, a woman who saw him for who he was, flaws and all. His love for her was a quiet, steady force, a profound and unshakable truth that guided his every decision. He stopped, his eyes landing on Alara and Julian. A sneer formed on his lips. Well, look what the cat dragged in. The prodigal son and his little friend. He said the last two words with a dripping condescension, his gaze raking over Alara's simple blouse and worn flats. Father, I hope you're not wasting company time with another one of Julian's pathetic social experiments. The story of the waitress and the CEO's son had become a legend within the company, a tale of a kindness that had turned into a fortune far greater than any money could buy. It was a story about the power of an unseen act, a simple gesture of humanity that had changed the lives of two people and the destiny of a powerful corporation. Julian's face tightened. Marcus, show some respect. This is Alara. She's just been hired as a junior project analyst. The final scene was not in an office, but in a quiet park, a simple, unassuming space in the heart of the bustling city. Julian and Alara sat on a bench, their hands intertwined, a silent, comfortable stillness between them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in a kaleidoscope of orange and purple. The world around them was a blur of hurried footsteps and honking cars, but in their quiet bubble, there was only peace. Marcus's scoff was loud and theatrical. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. A junior analyst. This is a joke, right? A waitress from some greasy spoon diner. What's her qualification? Her ability to carry a tray. This is an embarrassment. Julian. A disgrace to the Vance name and to everything father has built. What's next? Julian asked, his voice low and content. Alara felt the blood rush to her face, a hot wave of humiliation. Her knuckles turned white as she clenched her hands in her lap, but she remembered her own words remained calm under pressure. She met Marcus's hostile gaze head-on, her expression unreadable. Alara smiled. Her eyes, the same gentle eyes he had seen in the rain, twinkling with a quiet light. The future, she said simply. Our future. And it's just beginning. Alexander's presence was a cold command. Marcus, that's enough. I made the decision. Alara is here on my authority. Her skills are more than what her resume suggests. The battle was over. Justice had been served, and two souls, brought together by a single act of kindness, were ready to face the future, together. Skills, Marcus sneered, his eyes still fixed on Alara. What, is she going to tell me which board members prefer their coffee with 2 sugars? This is a company, not a charity. We can't have street rats running around our offices just because Julian had a moment of misplaced empathy.